Welcome to this third GVC Conversations webinar of the 2022 Network O Global Value Chains Conversation Series. This is the third in a series of webinars which we've had featuring new or recent books or special issues which have come out. Today's session is going to focus on a recent special issue of California Management Review, which Rajat Panwar, Jonathan Pinksey, and Valentina de Marchi have edited. The special issue and the theme of today's webinar is the future of global supply chains in a post-COVID-19 world. We're really grateful to have a number of the authors of the special issue here today. They're going to be talking to us a little bit about their specific papers, their contributions to the special issue, but they're also going to be drawing out questions and what implications there are for this broader question of what global supply chains or global value chains may look like in following COVID-19. So all of the speakers have been given that remit to both speak to their paper and to speak to this wider point of discussion, which we're really looking forward to getting everybody's thoughts and insights into as we move into the discussion part. So we're going to start with a few comments from a number of the authors. First, Valentina de Marchi, followed by Gary Gereffi. And sorry, one or two of these papers, many of these papers speakers also have multiple other authors, and some of those authors are present and some of them are not present. So I may not mention everybody's name, but Valentina will be speaking, Gary will be speaking, Liena will be speaking, and then Paul will be speaking as well, and Giulio, and there may be authors who will also contribute to the discussion too. So I'm going to pass over to Valentina to start us off as I open up the slides.
Thank you, Rory. It's very nice to be here. I'm usually part of this webinar series in the role of presenting and organizing. It's very nice also to be this side as a speaker, and especially to share this effort, which is joined with Jonathan and Rajat. Jonathan is also already here. Rajat, the other co-editor, may join later, which started really in the middle of the COVID-19, where we were still all struggling to understand what will happen. What was clear, even to people that were not technical or were not already into GVCs, is that we expected big changes to take place, but it was not clear what, how, and when. So this special issue really was aimed at try to gather some of the insights and the initial thoughts about this issue. And you see on screen all the really great contributions and authors that supported us in this effort and in shaping these special issues. But what I will do today, and I will do with the next slides, is to try to share with you some of the key insights. Next slide, please, Rory, that emerge cross-cutting across the papers, and especially trying to share with you the way we're trying to interpret all these different the changes taking place. One of the effort that we aim at doing was really to try to answer the question in a very policy-driven type of context. Will the world of GVC will be very diverse after COVID-19 or not? And part of this answer have changed over time, of course. And what we have asked all the authors to report is not just to share the key insights of their papers, but also what's next, what could be done now, because things are changing so fast that we really want to use the opportunity to share among us what is going on and what we should look at. But so to try to make sense of these big complexities, it seems that everything was changing, but we tried in this editorial that I'm briefly introducing, just to leave the floor to the three speakers, was to use existing lenses to try to interpret a brand new world we were seeing outside. And so what we did was to use the four traditional pillars that are used in GVC studies to understand the key dynamics of GVCs, starting from the geographical scope, which was the questions that attracted so much attention for many policymakers and practitioners, asking the question, well, will the world be more local than it was before? Will COVID-19 drive the end of GBCs? Actually, what is emerging cross-cutting among the studies that we're collecting in the special issue is that indeed reshoring, nearshoring may take place, but definitely at a much smaller scale than it was initially thought when COVID-19 hit. And especially that, as it is very typical of GBC studies, we see very big variation in terms of industries and countries. So we don't expect any general pattern, but rather more diversified patterns going at the very micro level, activity by activity, with some changes taking places, but not necessarily at the broader scale. Another interesting insight came by taking the upgrading pillar as a lenses to interpret the change, and especially taking this bottom-up perspective from the supplier perspective, and many of the articles in the special issue was reflecting on the change into what is expected from suppliers, with the idea that more and more efficiency would be one part, but then also the ability to be better able to manage risks will be more and more requested to suppliers, because there is a clear understanding. For example, I'm passionate about sustainability, and we know, unfortunately, that we shall expect many more crises, for example, related with climate change. And after COVID-19, definitely, we are all very aware that this is more and more the case. And so there is an increasing attention from scholars, but also practitioners, on how to better manage to ensure upgrading, not necessarily efficiency oriented, but in a broader way. And in this interesting contribution point to the role of technologies, it enhances these opportunities as suppliers. Two more pillars we took into account, and there is governance and more institutions or state-firm relationship. And as for governance, the papers, of course, were written in a time where we are still in the middle of the change. And again, that's why we're also interested to hear from the authors what changed, what is different, what is more. But something that more than one paper were pointing to is that we do expect that crises like this emphasis on resilience that is taking place is actually going to impact more and more in the need to move toward from ends off toward more hands-on type of governance mechanisms. Again, with interesting evidence or insights coming when it comes to how to govern different activities, because again, we can't say any general element, because we really need to take a more detailed analysis to get broader view. And the fourth pillar was, of course, the institutional settings, which we carve much more into the state-firm relationships. And I will not say much more, because following my presentation, Gary's one will delve a lot into this with specific examples showing to what extent states interacted very heavily and impacting the governance, not necessarily in an effective way. But definitely there is a clear evidence in that, especially in strategic industries, the role of state is entering very much more into, more deeply into the understanding of the governance of global value chain. So with these special issues, we were very and I think that Rajat also joined us today. We're very happy to have the chance to provide a framework or a context for ongoing research to be shared. But again, this is far from trying to be comprehensive on a topic that is really changing over time. So the idea for today, and then I will stop and leave the floor to Rory to introduce the speakers, is really to share what we learned, but more to use this opportunity for us to be together to reflect about what we want to do next. What do we feel like leveraging from these initial results should be addressed in the next periods. So I'm very excited to be here, and I want to thank again all the network co-organizers for setting this up, and all the speakers to come. And I will stop here and again be happy to engage further later on for the discussion. Thank you.
Valentina, thank you for that introduction, overview of the introduction or framing article for this special issue. There's loads of those aspects, which we could probably talk about in a lot more detail when we come to the discussion. But first, we're going to have comments and contributions from some of the authors of the paper. So the first paper is, which we're going to have presented, is from Gary Gereffi. I'll just move to your slide now, Gary, about COVID-19 medical supplies. So over to you.
Great, thank you, Rory, and thanks to the organizers and also to the co-editors of this special issue of Cambridge Management Review. Two initial comments. One, this is, I think, the only special issue I've seen, and a lot have been coming out recently, that had video links that the journal created for each of the articles, like 3 or 4 minute intros, which I thought was just fantastic as a way to generate interest. So I was really impressed about that. And a second thing that impressed me, and this will get more to the content, is that at least 3 of the articles had the term resilience in the title somewhere. So I think that this is helping us understand one of the key themes that's going to emerge. This paper I'm presenting was co-authored, and I know all of our papers are co-authored. This was with Pavita Pananand and Torben Peterson, who are on the call or will be. So the next slide, Rory. I've got just 2 slides to highlight. So 3 key points that we wanted to emphasize. First is this concept of what resilient global value chains mean. Some of you I know are aware that in June 2021, the Biden administration issued a 100-day report where they were focusing on supply chain vulnerabilities in the US context, and they were looking at semiconductors, pharmaceutical active ingredients, large-scale batteries for electric vehicles, and rare earth minerals, and they framed their key report around rebuilding resilient value chains. I think the point we wanted to make in this paper, and we tried to carry it through each of the 4 product cases, is that it's best to think about resilience at 3 different levels. There is the level of the firm, and a lot of the early discussion around COVID-19 was around this issue at the firm level of whether supply chains were breaking. You know, were they too rigid? Had they emphasized cost optimization and Asian sourcing or offshore sourcing too much? And definitely that's a part of the debate. And so resilience in that context was a call for firms to build more flexibility or redundancy into the supply chain. So that was one issue that focused a lot on firm strategy. But a second theme that's very familiar to the global value chains people is that industries differ a lot in terms of how firms articulate those strategies. And in particular, the geographic configuration of different product-specific supply chains is quite distinct. The governance structures in these industries is different. So we wanted to emphasize there's a separate definition of resilience that operates at the global industry level. And then there's a third level that came out quite importantly in the COVID-19 discussion, which was the role of the state and in particular national security issues, particularly when we had product shortages. So the plea in the paper was, let's take each of the 3 issues. They've got different units of analysis. The firm and the state were alluded to in Valentina's last pillar, but the industry level is also important. Second, in this paper, we wanted to show that good GVC analysis really has to be product specific. And we know that there was a lot of attention during COVID-19 to the category called medical supplies that included lots of different items. So in this paper, we took 4 types of medical supplies that were important in the COVID-19 setting: rubber gloves, face masks, ventilators, and vaccines. And we wanted to make the case that there were really different resilience dynamics and quite different GVC stories for each of those 4 products. In the case of rubber gloves, this was an instance where Malaysia in particular was a dominant exporter, and Malaysia and Thailand together had over 80% of global exports of rubber gloves. So in that particular case, a key theme with resilience dynamics was export efficiency of those two leading countries, and in particular, the role of Malaysia. Face masks was a really different case. Face masks of all these products was the only product that had demand both on the side of medical personnel, the doctors, the nurses, the patients, but also ordinary consumers, because as we know, many countries began to call for face masks as a form of protection. So as we can imagine, the demand for face masks in different countries was spiking 100-fold and more compared to earlier periods. So the question of how could countries scale up to meet that demand was an extremely important issue, especially in 2020, the first from like month 3 2020 to month 9 or 10. And the story we focus on in the article is really the difference between China versus the United States. And in the case of China, which was the world's leading exporter of face masks, and countries like the United States were relying on China for, and EU as well, well over half of all PPE and up to 80–90% of face masks. China in the early months was focusing on domestic demand for face masks, but around March, April, they really began to lean on state-owned enterprises to produce the filters needed for face masks, and they scaled up production and quickly got back into the export game. Whereas in the US case, the Trump administration was pressuring US multinationals to try to scale up production, and that took a longer period of time, and there were other complexities. So China versus US were two very different stories in face masks. Sorry, ventilators, a separate case that early in the pandemic was considered very, very essential because many people were dying in intensive care units. But eventually ventilators, to scale that up, required cross-industry collaboration between medical supply makers and auto firms, for example, that were quite able to source the multiple components. And vaccines is a very special and interesting case that required lots of state-supported innovation in 8 or 9 countries around the world. So we wanted to show that even though medical supplies seems like one type of industry, from a GVC point of view, you have 4 very different product dynamics. And the final kind of main takeaway is we wanted to address the issue that is occurring and was occurring in a number of countries, but what does post-pandemic resilience look like? And there certainly was a reaction because of the national security emphasis that maybe post-pandemic resilience requires more reshoring. And there was some articles that were saying that with the pandemic and the fragmented supply chains, this marked the end of globalization or deglobalization. And we wanted to make a very different point that reshoring is one of the new policy changes that might occur in a selective way, but by itself, reshoring will not guarantee resilience. National economies simply aren't big enough to hold most of these supply chains, even relatively simple ones like face masks. So we wanted to then focus on innovation and global solutions. So we had these kind of 3 messages: what resilience means, product-specific analysis, and the importance of looking at the post-pandemic resilience situation and not just try to generalize from crisis. Okay, next slide, please, Rory. So in terms of looking ahead, a few key points. One, it is important, I think, now that we're entering a post-pandemic era, in the sense that it seems like COVID-19 is becoming more endemic rather than a pandemic. You know, how do we sort out the pressures for deglobalization or reglobalization? Sorry. And in many cases, that's also being framed around regionalization. So we try to emphasize that governments and firms are exploring several options to try to bring about supply chain resilience. One is that you could make them more domestic, and reshoring or bringing production back to home countries is one way to do that. Stockpiles is another way to do it. Stockpiles are very complicated to manage. A second theme is making supply chains shorter, and that a lot of that is around nearshoring. So in the case of the US, Mexico, Central America could be logical places to consider building up supplies as opposed to sourcing so heavily out of Asia or in Europe. There's Western Europe and Eastern or Central Europe connections. So lots of ways to think about reshoring, including in Asia. And another third set of policy issues is make supply chains more diversified. And a lot of multinationals early on, especially in terms of China sourcing, always had sort of unwritten rules where this is a China +1 or China +2 or +3 strategy, where they knew China might be a critical production base or supply chain partner, but they didn't want to be wholly dependent on China. So they always had a strategy of a couple alternate supply points. Well, this has now become a much bigger issue in terms of thinking, how do you reduce dependence around different trusted partners or strategic suppliers? And I know in the US context, they're really trying to think about what that means. There's a trade and technology council between US and EU countries trying to figure out what kind of partnerships can be built. And in some cases, those partnerships can be with distant countries. So US and South Korea, for example, or US and Japan have particularly close relations. So there's, our argument in general is more towards the reglobalization side. We think that the way these arrangements are going to be sorted out is going to be reconfiguring dimensions of globalization where all these options and maybe a couple others are on the table. A particularly important theme, and especially when you got to face masks or vaccines, was what roles China and India are going to play in future medical supply GVCs. For personal protective equipment, like face masks, rubber gloves, hospital gowns, et cetera, China was supplying US and EU over 50% of their PPE items, and for particular products, much higher than that. So we know that China has tremendous production capabilities, but in this pandemic situation in the early months, China's supply to the rest of the world was interrupted because China was focusing on domestic demand. But I think as the dependence on China became more in public consciousness, there's a big reaction in a lot of countries to rethink over-reliance on China, and also for firms. And this is going beyond just the pandemic. It has to do also with the trade wars or trade tensions, innovation issues. So rethinking what role China is going to play, not only in medical supply GVCs, but in other GVCs like electronics and the digital technologies, we think is a really important research topic. But India is very, very important also when you get into the medical supplies, especially vaccines. India has the largest production capability for vaccines, and it's got certainly innovation potential, as Rory knows from his great research on the pharmaceutical industry. So we have to rethink what role India plays. And if when you look at something like active ingredients in pharmaceuticals, which was one of the industries flagged in that Biden White House report, it was interesting that in many cases, India might be the key source of supply for a number of pharmaceuticals coming into the US, but China was the key source of the active ingredients going to India. So again, from a supply chain point of view, or a global value chain point of view, we have to link the analysis of final products with the analysis of key intermediate inputs in order to try to come up with what the right kind of policy recommendations are. And this becomes really important when people talk about reshoring. If you're worried about pharmaceutical supply and you're going to reshore in the US, are you going to just reshore active ingredients? And if so, for which products? Or if you're talking about electronics, and we're talking about cutting edge semiconductors, are you going to build up capacity in the US for cutting edge semiconductors, but legacy semiconductors like in autos or other industries would be farmed out internationally? So we think that those issues really have to be sorted out. And finally, I think, especially again around vaccines, the medical supply case really raises the role of multilateral organizations, because for the last 10 years or so, I think there's been a sentiment that multilateral organizations like World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, maybe even the ILO, are all losing relevance to some degree as emerging economies are becoming much stronger. And as the whole geopolitics of global trading systems have been shifting. But I think in this case, the World Health Organization and its programs for trying to contribute to equitable vaccine distribution and other UN agencies like UNICEF and other partners really suggest that there is a key role for multilateral organizations. But so far, the results have been really uneven. There's a lot of complexity of who's going to fund, the legitimacy aspects of coming through multilateral versus bilateral. So again, it's a research topic that, depending on the question, needs to be sorted out. So these are the three areas we thought came out of our article that point to important issues over the next few years that we think GVC research needs to focus on. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. I think you didn't just unpack resilience, but you also really did a great job at unpacking this broad category of medical supplies and medical industries, which are actually multiple different products with very different dynamics ongoing. So our next speaker is going to be Liena Kano, who's going to share your own slides, if that's okay. You're on mute still.
Okay.
Now we can hear you.
Happens all, slides are on, I'm unmuted. Okay. Thank you very much to the conference, to the seminar organizers and to the co-editors of the special issue and to all the authors who have contributed. So I'm presenting on behalf of Rajneesh Narula and Irina Surdu, who unfortunately cannot be here. Turns out that even with Zoom, you cannot be in two places at the same time. But so anyway, they're here in spirit. So our paper is also has resilience in its title, as Gary pointed out. Understanding the impact of managerial governance adaptations in maintaining global value chain resilience. So our starting point is that we wanted to reflect on what the configurations of the global value chain actually entail. And our first observation was that GVC configuration reflects a variety of considerations, and some of them are structural. And this is where the majority of the conversation seems to happen in the scholarly and also practitioner conversation is, okay, what can change in response to COVID-19 or other external shocks in the structure of the global value chain? So that entails reshoring, nearshoring, regionalization, essentially decisions pertaining to who performs what activities where, and how the linkages are organized. But there's also another side of it. So we in this paper, we specifically distinguish managerial governance from structural governance. And here we are talking about more finer grain mechanisms that occur within the structure of the global value chain. So these are decisions pertaining to individual behaviors. So they a lot of them are relational in nature, and they're dealing with rethinking contracts, redirecting knowledge flows, upgrading competencies, changing relationships with suppliers, and entrepreneurial initiatives, entrepreneurial retooling. So more finer grain processes and routines that actually are within lead firm managers' control to a larger extent, even regardless of the industry or the macro level environment where the firm is situated. So our main point here is that changes to structural governance, such as reshoring, vertical reintegration, shifts in location are not always feasible. And now that I guess it's been some time since we have conceived this article, it becomes pretty obvious, and both Valentina and Gary have touched on that. And even when these changes are possible, I'm going to repeat what Gary has already said. Reshoring does not guarantee resilience, and reshoring can be simply inefficient or unprofitable. So in this situation, what can the lead firm managers do? So in this paper, we go over the more nuanced adaptations to GVC management practices. So we call them managerial governance adaptations. This is the bulk of essentially our argument. We distinguish between three different classes, three different types of managerial governance adaptations that can help firms boost the resilience of their GVCs. So the first one is interfirms. So these are the adaptations that happen among the different firms that comprise the global value chains. One that we argue is rethinking contracts. So potentially there may be more equity contracting among suppliers that would increase the reliability of the exchange in the global value chain. Also greater emphasis on relational governance to safeguard exchange and to aid with the flow of information through the global value chain, through the whole network. Another aspect here is extra GVC managerial governance adaptations. So these are changes pertaining to relationships with actors that are located outside of the immediate formal global value chain of the firm. So these are the relationships with governments, with institutions, and we argue that in order to increase resilience, firms can engage in targeted corporate diplomacy efforts with actors outside of the global value chain to, again, access information in a timely manner, safeguard the exchange, and so on. So we tried to come up with examples of firms that have done that. And of course, this will also secure certain reputational assets for lead firms. And the last one, perhaps the most important one, is the type of intra-firm managerial governance adaptation, where firms actually try to recombine and alter their own resources in order to increase global value chain resilience. So here, some of the aspects that we discuss are investment in technology, investment in specific technological assets that would allow for quick pivots, end-to-end supply chain visibility, as well as entrepreneurial retooling. And we can see now that some time has passed that firms that suffered less in the pandemic are the ones who were able to quickly reroute the flow of goods from, distribution centers to directly to consumer homes, quickly retool their production to come up with ways to produce sanitizers by breweries and things like that. So this is, I guess, the last type of managerial governance adaptations that we're arguing is going to enhance long-term resilience in the face of crisis. So I've kind of run through the paper very quickly, and now, so what is next? I think that with everything that's happened in the last, I guess, year or a couple of years since we first conceived that article points to the fact that the future crisis is probably a certainty, and it's really a question of when rather than if is when the next external shock will strike. So just a couple of months ago here in Canada, we had the trucker convoy blocking one of the largest land borders between Canada and the US. And of course, there is a crisis unfolding as we speak in Ukraine that also has long-ranging implications for lead firms and global value chains. So I would argue that managerial governance adaptations are still important or just as important as ever. And I think what the current crisis shine light on that we really need to understand the interactions between the macro level forces, network level linkages, firm level strategies and operations, and micro level decision making. And the case in point, and one of the most interesting aspects of this to me right now, is the impact of the home country or the impact of the firm nationality versus host country embeddedness. So for example, an American firm with GVC operations in Russia right now is subject to multiple pressures from multiple governments. So I guess if the directive or the pressure for the home government from the US government is to follow the sanctions imposed on Russia, then I guess the impact is clear that the firm needs to pull out. However, I think the regulators are typically boundedly rational, and the governments, the role of governments are certainly going to deepen, and I agree with that. But the regulators sometimes don't really understand the firm level investment and the firm level actions and operations that need to actually take place in order to follow the government directives. So for the American firm with operations in Russia, what is the impact on the obligations to, I guess, the local workforce that this firm employs, the suppliers that are located in other countries, in the third countries, that are also going to be impacted by the actions of the firm. I guess the local consumers if the firm produces essential goods. So these impacts are so interlinked and far-ranging, and I would argue that we still don't really understand these linkages, and neither do the governments. So I think that's a very interesting part to explore. Another interesting direction for future research, at least for me, because my other interest is in family firm internationalization, is the differential impact of external forces on different GVC players. So, for example, how does ownership affect the GVC resilience in the face of external crisis? Are family firms going to be affected differently? How about public versus private ownership or state-owned enterprises? Also, the issue of small and medium-sized firms, both as suppliers or lead firms. So we know in IB research that SMEs have a number of differential features. They're probably more small and nimble and innovative, so they can pivot easier, but at the same time, they don't have the same kind of slack resources that allow them to stockpile reserves in the hard times when they're hit by crisis. And we know that SMEs have suffered disproportionately during COVID. So how does an external shock impact their GVC participation? So these are some directions for future research, and Rory has given me a 2-minute sign. So I'm going to stop here I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Liena. And I think that was great in terms of building on this discussion, which is already really going on this theme of unpacking resilience, and especially distinguishing between the structural aspects and then these multiple layers of managerial governance and the different ways that that is manifest. And so the third paper of the kind of after the introduction, which we're going to have presented now, is led by Paul Ryan, with also Giulio, who is also going to speak as well. So over to you, Paul, whenever you're ready.
I am actually starting, Rory.
Okay, sorry, wrong way around.
If you don't mind.
Yeah, you're welcome to.
Yeah. So, well, hello everyone, first of all. For those of you who haven't met me yet, my name is Giulio Buccioni, and together with Paul Ryan, we both work at Trinity College Dublin. This is a joint paper that we produced together with Magella Giblin and Ulf Andersson. And it's a paper that really reflects our own background and interest in research, mixing economic geography, international business, and of course, global value chains. Let me first provide you a little bit of context for this study. We have been studying the MedTech, medical devices, global value chain for quite a while now. And the paper that we produced, which now appears on the special issue on California Management Review, is a longitudinal study that trying to track over time the evolution of the governance of a global value chain, but also the upgrading trajectory of foreign subsidiary. So the context here is the global value chain, which is orchestrated and coordinated by multinational enterprises, which is very common in many GVCs. But the different angle that we're trying to bring in is a type of governance hierarchy, which was largely overlooked in the GVC literature. And if you can think back of the GVC governance model 2005, one of the five governance means is in fact hierarchy. So why we thought not investigating this specific type of governance and understanding the relationship between hierarchy as a specific governance typology and the upgrading opportunities for foreign subsidiaries. In this specific case, the M&As are from the US, and they conducted investment in the west side of Ireland, in the city of Galway, which has become over the years a prime hub for medtech production and is now home to numerous indigenous startups that resulted from foreign investments. But this is a different story. So can we please move on to the next slide? So upgrading in hierarchical GVCs, we tried really to unpack a black box. We tried to look into what is happening within hierarchy governance in GVC. And what we realize is that not only this topology of governance has been largely under considered, but the general sentiment is that there's not much happening within it, right? So an M&E controls foreign subsidiaries, and in a way it dictates what subsidiaries around the world should do or shouldn't do. In reality, what we found out is that within the hierarchy typology, there are, let me put it this way, different shades of hierarchy. So there's no one solution fits all, but hierarchy can come in different forms. In the case of the MedTech GVC, and specifically the case we consider, the foreign subsidiary located in Galway over the years had the freedom to experiment new economic activities, to engage with higher value adding functions along the value chain. So this process was in a way permitted, allowed by a type of hierarchy that was not as strict as we thought in the beginning of our study. In essence, the M&Es delegated a certain amount of freedom to the foreign subsidiary, and the foreign subsidiary, well, I should say, the management of the foreign subsidiary took advantage of this degree of freedom to try out new activities. And over the years, as we were tracking the evolution of this subsidiary, we realized that the plant in Galway started to specialize in innovation-related activities, therefore moving from being a mere executor of value chain function to becoming an innovator within a global value chain. So why this matters for the special issue, why we thought our angle could contribute to the ongoing debate. Well, and I'm moving now down to the green box. As we are collecting data and analyzing data, we, of course, got involved into these debates about the future of global value chain. And I can remember distinctly, it's March 2020, when Willy Schiff from Harvard Business School published this piece on the MIT's Loan Management Review asking, is it time to rethink global supply chains? You may have seen it. And if you haven't, I do recommend you to take a look at this piece. So essentially he is contemplating the idea that COVID-19 is finally imposing a general and deep reconsideration of the way we have thought about organizing GVC at a global level. And therefore, Paul, myself, Margella, and Ulf start debating about this very topic. And the very interesting lines that many were proposing is, let's embrace reshoring. Let's shorten supply chains, like Valentina were introducing at the beginning of this session. Let's make them shorter. Let's regain control over critical functions that are now scattered across the world. And this is fine in principle, right? But we were wondering, are we really willing to sacrifice the efficiency that global value chains brought to numerous Western M&Es over the years? So reshoring can take place, although with many difficulties, but even if it would take place, what is the cost associated with reshoring? And more in general, is it really necessary to think about reshoring as the only way to regain control over GVC, or to put in different terms, to improve the resilience, to enhance the resilience of GVCs? And we turn back to our case, we collected further data, we tried to understand better whether we could contribute to this ongoing debate, and we realized that in fact, our case was suggesting an interesting result. And the result is that efficiency and resilience are not either or values in GVC, but they can coexist, okay? So a multinational enterprise can in fact improve the degree of resilience that it has over GVC, while at the same time keep benefiting from the efficiency that global value chain can offer. And looking back and linking this back to our analysis, what we found out was that not only the American headquarters could ramp up the production of critical parts of its value chain when COVID-19 struck, and I'm referring here specifically to the production of ventilators that was in high demand in the US, and because the M&Es had tight control over the subsidiary in Galway, it was able to ramp up production without too many difficulties. But this was only possible because over the years, thanks to a typology of governance, which, as I discussed before, was not as tight as we assumed it could be, the foreign subsidiary had the freedom to experiment new activities and to improve its capabilities over the years. So long story made short, this typology of GVC governance hierarchy can come in different forms. The case we have analyzed suggests that if hierarchy comes with a certain amount of freedom that the M&Es gives to the subsidiary, if effectively coordinated and managed by local management team, can engage in higher value adding activities and build superior production capabilities that at the same time can strengthen the resilience of the GVC, but also can contribute to the overall efficiency of the GVC controlled by the M&Es. Now, we were also conscious that this is a piece published on an outlet, California Management Review, that has a good readership within managers, and therefore we came up also with some managerial insights, and these are reported in the gray box. So what we put together is a sort of 3-step to help managers, first of all, assess the potential capabilities of the subsidiary and pave the way for their subsequent upgrading strategy. Secondly, once potential capabilities upgrading is assessed, we suggest a second important step, which is supporting upgrading trajectories at the local subsidiary level. And this is quite interesting because it basically postulates that an M&E controlling a GVC should not simply be led by cost efficiency strategies, but they should consider forest subsidiaries as loci for innovation development. As upgrading takes place, it's also very important for the M&Es, for the headquarters, to reconsider the governance structure, which doesn't mean that it has to move from hierarchy back to, say, modular or relational or captive. It can remain within the hierarchy typology, but it has to conceive this typology of hierarchy of a governance as a typology which can offer multiple layers of control and freedom to the foreign subsidiary. So these are, in a nutshell, our key insights. And as far as new research avenues are concerned, I will let Paul Ryan take the lead and discuss them further. Thank you.
Can you push on? Thanks, Rory. Hello, everyone, and greetings from Ireland. I'm all that stands between us and a debate on these bigger issues where you can have access to greater minds than mine. So I'll be as brief as possible on this, just picking up what's next. So our principal concern, given the makeup of our research team, was, at the nexus of IB and GVC theory. And we know that there's been a lot of calls for research at this nexus and a greater understanding across the two theories. As far back as 2014 with Valentina, and there's a really nice piece in Jibs by Gabriel Benito as a commentary on Roger Strange and John Humphrey. And essentially, what we're concerned with is the forgotten sibling in the governance modes, which, as Julia said, is hierarchy, and how that lends itself to further research that explores issues of efficiency and resilience as not being necessarily a trade-off. And again, in the wider context, as others have mentioned earlier, of the shifting sands of globalization and deglobalization. And, recently, Larry Fink of BlackRock saying that, the Ukrainian invasion was the end of globalization. And of course, others being more moderated on it, like The Economist and so on. So this is a context for research that looks even more intensely at efficiency and resiliency, not necessarily as a trade-off, particularly within the multinational enterprise. And the other part as well was that, a lot of emphasis is on external activities, but for knowledge-intensive multinationals that have a strong imperative to protect knowledge, they tend to have a lot of in-house innovation. And again, this is an aspect of the GVC model that we were particularly interested in. I think Gabriel Benito has said the M&E is not obsolete. And he calls for, and I think we addressed this, that a lot of internalization theory might be seen as rather static. But the dynamics of GVC lends itself to a more dynamic model. And we found this was really useful in taking the idea of subsidiary upgrading and even developing that into an area of trust and trust within the GVC relationship internally. The next one is reshoring. Okay, there's a local bias to this. So a lot of people speak about reshoring and they think of the big and powerful. Ireland, heavily dependent on foreign direct investment. We shudder, we reel back with horror when reshoring is encouraged by Trump or Japan, but particularly anyone in America, even Biden. And I was glad that in the editorial, Valentina and Rajat and those referred to reshoring as a quixotic idea that has, elements of impracticalities and so on. However, there is going to be greater push as deglobalization becomes a stronger force. There are going to be continued calls for reshoring. So we like research that looks at these incongruities of reshoring, i.e., if you spend 20 years implanting knowledge and capabilities in a location, how do you actually reshore that, and to whose benefit? The third one is governance mode and upgrading. And again, Julia touched strongly on this, so I will finish briefly on this. One of the things that we noticed was happening in the IB literature, Philip Nell touched on this, was the devolution of activities beyond just simple shared services activities from HQ down to the subsidiary. And we had noted this was the case in terms of coordination and governance of global value chains for product divisions. So in the multi-product divisional multinational enterprise, we discovered that some of the value chains were actually being managed by the subsidiary. Now, this is really important in IB thinking, because one of the greatest concerns of any subsidiary is staying alive, survival. And the power dynamics between it and HQ are hugely relevant here. But if it takes control of the GVC, its importance, not just in delivering, as we know, research and development, but its importance within the multinational becomes extensive, and its influence becomes extensive, and its sway over fellow subsidiaries in terms of intra-firm competition aligned with competition is an area of interest here. So you can see that all of the key elements that we would be talking about for future research pertain widely to the hierarchical governance model within the context of subsidiary upgrading within that M&E. Okay, I'll leave it there, Rory.
Thanks very much, Julio and Paul. Like the other papers, unpacking resilience, but this time really unpacking what you framed as the forgotten sibling of hierarchy in terms of types of GVC governance. So there's lots to discuss for the